Gone to God, a Civil War family's ultimate sacrifice, and here we are with Keith out at Turkeyville, the Great Battle of Turkeyville. Wow.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, you've written this book, and we're excited to hear about it.
Well, this is a project I worked on for a number of years, and it involves 3 Virginia boys, which ironically were in my wife's family, which is how I came across quite a collection of original source material, letters and diaries. The younger sister of these 3 boys would have been my wife Allie's great-grandmother. So I married well in a lot of ways, but when I received a lot of this material, then I fleshed out the story and wrote it over the last decade or so, and wanted to get it published during the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, because there are a lot of Civil War enthusiasts, as you can see out here today.
It is. It's real popular. So who did they serve with?
They were Confederates. The story itself could be North or South, though, and there are 3 young boys who enlisted, fought for the 4th Virginia Cavalry, and all died within 8 months of each other, which is the crux of the story. It's really a family story about loss and remembrance, and how this family dealt with 3 boys being killed in the service of their cause. The family also lost a 15-year-old daughter to illness during the war, so it was quite a traumatic time for this particular family. But as I said, given the scope of the war and the losses north and south, this could be a family either for the Union or for the Confederacy.
Now, were some of these letters what the soldiers wrote back to the family, or and
most of the letters themselves were addressed to their youngest sister, who at the time was probably 11 or 12. So they're very much a family narrative in the letters, although they do tell items of interest about what's going on during the war. The other key piece was a diary that the middle brother, Robert Tolles, wrote. He was captured scouting for the Confederacy and was taken to Washington, D.C. and the then infamous Old Capitol Prison, which was a place where spies and initial Confederate prisoners were sourced out to different prisoner camps throughout the North. In this case, he was kept there, and he was one of only 16 men to escape from Old Capitol, and he kept a diary of that time. Ironically, he reported back for duty and then was killed in action, so I guess he probably would have been better off staying at Old Capitol Prison.
Oh, boy. Was that one of the tougher prisons to be at? I mean, if that was spies, I would imagine.
The description in the book, doesn't make it sound like a Holiday Inn Express, but it definitely, I think, was maybe nicer than some of the ones we hear about, like Andersonville in the South. They didn't have the resources to maintain the prisoners and feed them. But I think, it was not a great place to be in, and he was determined to get back and show up for duty. So that part of the story is very interesting. We have a Michigan connection because the older brother, ironically from Virginia, came to Ann Arbor for a semester and went to University of Michigan, strangely enough.
Before the
war, yeah.
Oh, wow, sure.
And then we also, Robert, the young man I just talked about who escaped from Old Capitol, was killed in battle at Trillion Station in 1864, fighting none other than Michigan's own George Armstrong Custer and his Wolverines.
Oh, wow.
So there were some nice intersections with my life and our family. I grew up in Indianapolis. My mom always said I was born on the south side of Indianapolis, so and I admired a lot of the Confederate leaders, which seemed more intriguing at the time than some of the Union leaders. But so I guess it's appropriate that I wrote this book about 3 Confederate cavalrymen.
Okay, so you've got relatives that are involved in.
Yeah, on my side of the family, we were still all in Germany at the time, which was probably fortunate. Had we been here, we would have been in Indianapolis. We probably would have been cannon fodder for the 11th Corps and the Union Army. But the Kehlbecks came over in 1876. But on my wife Allie's side of the family, they go back in Virginia to the 1600s, so that's the reason why her side of the family had three young men fighting for the Confederacy.
Yeah. Oh wow, that's amazing. So really, did your interest start with the Civil War before that you discovered these materials?
I was a history major at Wabash College, but before that, when I was 10 years old, my family took a bus trip from Indianapolis to Washington, D.C., and we took a side trip to Gettysburg. And I also had a great aunt who gave me a copy of a Bruce Catton book, and I was kind of hooked. It was in the 60s, which was the centennial time for the Civil War, so I collected Civil War stamps and did paint by number Civil War things. I was a real sort of history geek back then, and it's continued today, so this was a nice project to work with from that perspective, but definitely have always loved the Civil War, and have a good collection of Civil War books, which my wife thinks is probably every book that's ever been written on the Civil War, but not even close.
They're still producing them today.
Not even close, yeah.
What's some of your more interesting kind of views on the Civil War and things that happened?
Well, I think, from a historian standpoint, I think it's always interesting to look at the original letters and diaries at the time, the contemporary writings, because I think we're so often guilty of, I guess, what one of my mentors calls presentism. We look at everything through the lens of what we know today. And what I found when I looked and transcribed these letters and diaries is that these are just people like us in a different setting, different time. They were motivated by a variety of different aspects of what they believed, both politically and how they perceived their states versus the relatively new federal government at the time. I think certainly we've come to understand that slavery was a big issue that drove the war, and that the end of slavery was a very important aspect of it, as was the preservation of the Union. So I think, to answer your question, I think the biggest aspect is that sometimes we think we know what these people, why they made decisions or why they didn't make decisions, but when you read the letters, and I always encourage people to try to search out original documents, original letters, you really get a sense of who they were and the things they wrestled with back then.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of talk about how for many years taxes were collected from the South and sent to the North to build northern cities, and very little return to the South and other issues like that.
Well, at the time, of course, the North was much more industrialized. The South was built on an agrarian farming society. Not every Southerner owned slave. In fact, a great majority didn't. But it was the underpinning of their economic system. And I think that's part of what motivated the struggle. A lot of people said it was unavoidable, and probably it was, and to our benefit today, these issues were resolved and we became one country again, and I think that's important.
There were quite a few writings that with the election of President Lincoln, they were very sure that he would take on that issue.
Lincoln,
although he had made statements, but
Lincoln is a fascinating person, obviously, for a variety of reasons, and just recently was the bicentennial Lincoln bicentennial celebration. There have been great books in recent years, great scholarships about President Lincoln, looking at everything from his first few months as president to decisions he made. Of course, the recent Lincoln movie was intriguing because it looked particularly at the 13th Amendment and the last days of his presidency. A very complex man, just like many of the other people at the time, but certainly a towering figure, and one who I think probably understood the stakes more than almost anybody else. I think we were fortunate to have him as president at the time.
He certainly seemed to take a very long view of the situation in history.
Well, and that's true. And I think, the interesting thing is I'm not sure he was even on the ballot in a number of states in the Confederacy before the war and the presidential election that, brought him the presidency. And so there was a great fear in the South that he was going to upset the apple cart, so to speak, and change things. He had a series of debates with Stephen Douglas that a lot of people are aware of, the senatorial race in Illinois in, I think, 1854. 1858. And so people were familiar with him. I think also he was a much more sophisticated politician and speaker, incredible, self-educated in many ways, but had quite a way with words. But he was a very smart politician, and even though they have the caricature of him as old Abe, the rail splitter, I think he was probably much more sophisticated than a lot of people realize in hindsight.
You saw the movie that came out. It really amazed me, the politics, we would almost feel fit right in today, the backroom deals, and you vote this way, we'll help you with that. And
it was actually an extraordinary, it was a tour de force, not only acting, but that aspect of it. And I think the first time I realized that Lincoln was much more than he seemed was when I read Gore Vidal's book a number of years ago called Lincoln, and it also portrayed him as sort of the ultimate politician. So I think Spielberg's film was certainly true to that. It really was extraordinary. Daniel Day-Lewis, who by the end of the movie, I actually thought I was watching Lincoln up there on the screen. Quite well done.
It was just amazing, the level of politics that you. And if you actually think it probably goes back to ancient Rome, I'm sure it had that same type of internal politics going on.
Absolutely.
O'Reilly, Bill, wrote a book on, have you read that one?
I have. It's a very approachable book on Lincoln's assassination, I guess, and he's done one on Kennedy as well. I thought it was very approachable, and I love any book that encourages people to read about this period of history, obviously. And my one goal in writing my book was to make it very readable. You don't have to be a Civil War geek to understand it. It has some battle aspects to it and things like that, but also a lot of just personal stories. And I think any book that reads easily and makes it easy for people to understand is a good one. I think O'Reilly's books definitely fall in that category.
Do you have any plans to do another book?
Actually, I'm working right now on a book that's a little bit of a subsection of this book. I talked about Old Capitol Prison earlier, and that's an intriguing thing, especially in today's culture with the Patriot Act and everything. We often forget Lincoln suspended habeas corpus that could throw people in Old Capitol Prison, basically, if you expressed views contrary to common wisdom. And Old Capitol was called the Bastille of the North. It was torn down right after the war. Ironically, it sat on the location of what the U.S. Supreme Court sits today. There hasn't been a good book written on it in probably 100 years. So a lot of the source material that I dealt with, including Robert's diary, gave us a first-hand picture of Old Capitol. I only used a small part of it this time. So tentatively, I've been working on a manuscript that involves Old Capitol, and I don't think it'll take me as long to write as this one did, but it certainly should be interesting, I think, from a lot of different perspectives on what went on behind the scenes during the war.
Yeah. You'd mentioned the spies and the situation there. What do you know about? It must have been kind of very interesting back then, both sides being Americans.
Well, it was, and of course the battlefields in the Eastern Theater were in Virginia. A lot of the territory was well known, especially to these Virginia boys, and they were cavalry, so they were used as detached scouts. They often went behind the lines. They were in uniforms, so they weren't technically spies, but when captured, they were, characterized as everything from bushwhackers to guerrillas to spies. I think both sides, both armies, wanted as intelligence as they could get, and the Confederates, especially at the start of the war with Jeb Stuart and their cavalry, was much better at that. And because these boys knew the area, they could get behind the lines, they could scout, they could give back information, and I think that's an important part of why Lee succeeded so much, especially early in the war.
I think just within the last few days ago, I saw I'm guessing it was PBS, quite a bit on the generals about how they had gone to the
West Point
together, and how the respect they had, even though they were on opposite sides and such.
Well, and also the Mexican War, which was in 1848, and a lot of them were trained, if you will, for the Civil War in that arena. they did know each other. A lot of times they were classmates. So many of the officers on both sides were casualties because of the Civil War. A lot of times they led from the front. So you had a great deal of casualties, especially at the command level, at the regimental command level, and sometimes even higher than that. So as the war went on, I think it was even more apparent that was the case. I think the other thing about the Civil War that we don't think about much today is the scope of the death. Drew Gilpin Faust wrote a book a few years ago called This Republic of Suffering, and in many ways mine's a microcosm of her book. She looked at death and dying and how people absorbed the enormity of the loss back then on sort of a macro scale. If we translated the total deaths, which are estimated around 700,000 on both sides combined, to today's population, it'd be 7 million deaths.
Right.
So when you think about 9/11 or Iraq, or, those are all tragic, but think about 7 million deaths, and then you get a sense of how wrenching an experience the American Civil War was.
Wow. That's really amazing. I have a question for you. How are you on recitations?
As in just giving a speech or reading something, I'd be happy to.
163.
Yeah. Sure.
Just joyfully, I find is just a really beautiful expression.
This is a hymn. We have a great letter from Robert Tolles, who was the last brother to be mortally wounded, and before he died, he was able to convey to his parents, who he knew would be grief-stricken, that he was dying with a clear conscience, and he was a very Episcopal young lad. His father was an Episcopal rector, so they often thought that this was just one step to the next level with heaven and everything, so it was the way they dealt with loss a little bit. And he had sent back, this was a song of him that he liked, that he wanted sung at his funeral. I tracked down the original sheet music for it. It's no longer in the Episcopal hymnals, and actually I got our church organist to play it for me, so it's quite a jaunty little tune, but the words are very poignant and really talk about this particular young man's expectations, if you will, even though he knew he was dying. Joyfully, joyfully onward I move, bound for the land of bright spirits above. Angelic choristers sing as I come, joyfully, joyfully, haste to thy home. Soon, with my pilgrimage ended below, home to the land of spirits I go. Pilgrim and stranger no more shall I roam, joyfully, joyfully resting at home. And I think that gives you a good sense of this young man and his family and how they approached life and death at a very difficult time in our history.
Oh, very good. All right, how do we find the book?
It is available.
Besides tracking you down, knocking on your door.
You can track me down in Marshall, and I'm happy to sell and inscribe books, hard or soft
There you
covers.
go, folks. You can get the signed autographed copy.
They're also available on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. We're working on getting them in some of the local bookstores, and there should be a review of it in Civil War Times Illustrated this fall by Bob Crick, who's a great friend and mentor. So, but definitely happy to inscribe and personalize any books, especially for my hometown area here.
All right, very good. And it's the three brothers and Gone to God. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you for interviewing me.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, it's a beautiful day here in Turkeyville.
All day today and tomorrow, I think they're going to reenact the Battle of Gettysburg here shortly. So
Yes,
that'll be interesting.
Yep. And and there was never actually a battle of Turkeyville. They never did make it up here, but
No. If we had gotten this far north, we would have all been in trouble, I think.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.